Thank you very much for joining us today for the GDN Conversation Series. This is session 4, where we'll be looking at trust frameworks as we think about how we build high value, high capacity, high scaled digital ecosystems. It's part of our trust series that we have done in partnership, the GDN with the Velocity Network Foundation. And I'm excited to introduce all my guests today. I'm Joanne Duklas. I am the Executive Director for the GDN Network and honored to speak with all of you today. Thank you so much, friends, for joining. I'm just going to go around the room and I'm going to ask each of you to tell us who you are, your organization, and we'll talk a bit further. Over to you, Etan.
Thanks, Joanne. Great to have you all be here with everyone. My name's Etan Bernstein. I am one of the co-founders of the Velocity Network Foundation. I've spent the last 30 years in global HR, so being on the HR side and the employer side, mostly helping global organizations try to figure out how to manage their workforce more effectively. And through that, realize that the whole way that data is created, shared, and evaluated by organizations is really broken. And we live in a digital age where things should be simple and easy and trustworthy, maybe as easy as they are using your iPhone. And they aren't in the world of HR and as well as in the world of education. And so 5.5 years ago, started the Velocity Network Foundation, which the aim is to build the global trust framework for the employment market, which I'm sure we'll talk about more today.
Thanks so much, Etan. It's always great to see you and chat with you. James.
Thanks, Joanne, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. I'm based in South Africa. I head up Jet Education Services, a non-profit, the last 32 years in South Africa. We work in all things education. You can see my background. So we try and kind of reinforce that all education thing. But for today, Joanne, particularly interested in interoperability conceptualizations, particularly those that are softer and more qualitative. I'm hoping we can talk about those and not only the technical things today. So looking forward to the session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Melanie.
Hello, I'm Melanie Gottlieb. Thanks, Joanne, for having us. I'm the Executive Director of ACRO, which is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admission Officers. We are a higher education association based in the United States, but with 2,300 member institutions and 15,000 individual members worldwide. We also have members in about 40 countries. I'm also here representing my other volunteer role, and that is as the president of the GDN. ACRO is one of the founding organizations of the GDN, and we have been deeply engaged in helping the GDN realize the global education and employment network.
Yes, it's wonderful to work with you, Melanie, and I'm so glad to have you here today. So when we think about trust frameworks, I have to ask all of you, what does trust framework mean to you? How do you define it in your context? Because I do think different organizations, different roles, we think of trust frameworks differently. And in the context of digital credentials, particularly, I'm interested to know your answer to that question. So I'll start with you, Melanie, if you don't mind. What does it mean when somebody says to you trust framework?
So coming from the area of higher education, and in particular, my member segment having to do with the records portion of higher education, a trust framework is really at the heart of what our members do, and it's at the heart of exchange of records in higher education. The trust is built from consistent alignment with general principles and standards and transparent information along the way. And so the upkeep of that trust framework is crucial in the higher ed space to enable records to be respected, to be shared, to maintain their value for the learner and for the institution. And so my members are very, very concerned about trust and integrity of records in order to enable that trust framework.
And actually, when you frame it that way, is it fair to say it could be a policy document, it could be a way of governing oneself, it could be a technology trust framework? I mean, it could be a multitude of things, yes?
It's actually all of those things, not just one of them. I think those things complement each other. The technology is an enabler of a trust framework, but at the heart of the trust framework is really all of the pieces that go into it that define the technology, the way the technology is used, the way the technology is structured, the way the technology is exchanged. So those are, I think they interplay quite nicely. And as the technology evolves, the trust framework also has to evolve in order to grow with it.
That's interesting. And I see you nodding, Etan. Pull some threads here. How does this relate to your world?
So I completely agree with everything Melanie just said. I want to take a step back and say, the way connecting very much to what Melanie was saying. Now, if you look at far back in history, we lived in small communities and we knew everyone in the community, right? So if you knew whether your barber was a good barber, and you knew whether the teacher knew how to teach in school, and trust was inherent in small communities. As the world became larger, and as we're all aiming at a world of global mobility of people and of their skills and their education credentials and so on, we lack the immediate person-to-person trust. We need systems and processes and governance and so on to know that although we don't necessarily know the institution that a person graduated from, or the employer that they claim to work for, or the assessment vendor that the person took an assessment with, or any other type in our world of types of credentials, that we can still feel confident that that information is correct, it's complete, it's consistent, it means what it means, it was actually issued by a trusted organization to a trusted person, so on. There are many questions that we didn't need to deal with in the past, and the more we become more global, the more we have more mobility, the more we want this to work frictionlessly, with less friction, the more we need a method that we, without having to question all these things, we can ideally have the flow of information. And before getting into our world, I think it's interesting to look at trust frameworks that exist in worlds that we take for granted. There's a really interesting example, which is the Visa trust framework. We all use our credit card or our Apple Pay or Google Pay around the world. And every time we show our chip, a whole world of governance, technology, legal data happens behind the scenes, which enables that transaction to be transacted in a trustworthy way. I know I'm not going to get ripped off, or there won't be any fraud through my payment, and the vendor knows that they're going to get paid. And behind the scenes, there are banks and communication methods and so on. That's a very robust trust framework, which we take for granted, but I think is a good example of when a trust framework really works, because it's almost transparent to us, right? We feel confident to put our credit card or our phone on a point of sale and make a transaction, and we somehow believe, most of us don't understand what actually happens behind the scenes, that this is all trustworthy, right? And that the right number will come out of my bank account at the right time and so on. And there's many members involved. The trust framework in our world, when we get into education and employment and so on, should act in the same way and is made up of many of the same elements. Melanie mentioned many of them. I'll just list some that we think are particularly important, right? And governance, how are decisions being made? Legal, what's the legal frameworks that ensure that this is compliant and lawful and all the relevant jurisdictions? What are the processes? What actually happens and gets flowed? How do we ensure that's consistent and compliant? How does data structured? All those elements, think about it in the visa example, are also true in the exchange of education, but also employment and licensure and skills-based data and so on across the labor market. And a trust framework in my context is a robust element that makes up all those things, that addresses the ability in the end for individuals and organizations to just feel confident if they understand it and that it really works. And now we can just focus on the individuals and their growth and their mobility, and not whether that data is truthful and is working correctly.
So I have a bit of a two-part question for you, James. Do these characteristics sort of define what would be a sample of a trust framework in your context? Or is there perhaps some nuance because you come from yet another different part of the world? And I'm interested, what's a trust framework mean to the South African context? What is relevant there?
Etan has sparked some thoughts, so I'm going to go off script from what I prepared because I think it's actually quite helpful. The Visa MasterCard example, Etan, is such a nice example to compare with. And I'm going to reflect on Joanne's question through that lens because that's a kind of enterprise framework for me in a way that has a kind of Forex calculator somewhere in there, that helps us with those different currencies and things as we trust that my South African rands and your Canadian dollars or whatever else, there's a fair calculation happening. And I think this is the issue I have, Joanne, and when we talk about, trust with regard to credentials, I think that back end is less mature. As compared to, for example, the Visa MasterCard example. So the maturity level of the back-end trust framework, needs all of us to work together. And by the way, Jet's also a GDN member. I actually forgot to say that because I think that's pretty important. We also support GDN. So if I would respond to it like this, I think, in thinking about today, I played around a little bit with different interoperability frameworks. And I know Etan, Velocity's done some really interesting work around this. But the general trend is, syntactic interoperability, semantic interoperability, and then there must be something more. So I just use a large language model and I said like, hey, give me a third level that is more socially orientated, that is more focusing on governance, Etan and Melanie, to your points. And it was quite interesting. It didn't take a lot of time to come up with this more mature interoperability framework, which might have a name, Etan, that you know better than me. But I just like, there's something here about the social side that is also, can we call it interoperability? But it's a side that is not the technology, Melanie. You mentioned just now, technology is a means to an end. So in my world, Joanne, this is what I worry about. I work mainly with government. And so when we talk about trust and credentials, what system can a government oversee that citizens of a country can trust? While we know across the world, trust has been eroded in governments more broadly, around the ability to manage our data and these kind of things. So this is an area I'm really preoccupied with. And, the area that I would want to just introduce a little bit, maybe we can get to it today, is a decentralized autonomous organization one way to build governance through these trust networks that is also not mature enough yet? We don't see enough discussion around DAOs, but I'm just like, there's something that interests me there, around the work that we're doing. Let me stop there. I think I've said enough for now, but, that's kind of my first response.
But you have pulled out a word that our audience may not be familiar with. You've talked about the DAO. If I heard you correctly, could you explain that concept a little bit? Because I don't want to assume people know exactly what you mean.
And from a non-expert as well, so I'm going to give it a go, but please Google it if you want a better one. Look, what we've trialed a little bit with a decentralized autonomous organization and the work that Roxana, Rajab, and I've done in South Africa. It's a kind of blockchain-based governance mechanism, simplified to a voting mechanism, if you want, where everybody has an equal ability to vote.
So, James, I think your voice is cut out. Can everybody hear James?
I've lost James.
Can you try again, James?
Okay. After
There you
all of
go.
that, I have to do it again. Are you like serious?
Yeah, you have
Okay,
to
so
do it again.
okay. So in basic terms, it's a blockchain-based voting mechanism at its most simplest form. Okay, but it's more than that. But at its simplest form, it allows equal parity in a governance mechanism for a citizen, for example, to influence a governance decision where, a more senior person, a minister, a chairperson, a CEO could influence the decision differently. So in a way, it allows a governance mechanism, in this case, perhaps for a credentialing schema, to be established so that the security, the trust, the mechanisms that govern the credential platform are organized in a way that there's parity of esteem between, in the case that Roxana and I've been working on, citizens, civil society, the public sector, and the private sector. So we've been calling it a CC by triple P mechanism, just to add to your acronyms, Joanne. Citizen, civil society, public-private partnership. And we found that a DAO in its simplest form could perhaps offer us some potential around this, but it's early days for us around exploring this.
So just to pull some threads here in thinking about trust frameworks, I think the key thing that I'm hearing is regional context matters. And in the particular context that you're in, that notion of everybody having an equal vote on things, equal participation, the DAO approach would be an important principle as part of any type of trust framework you would adopt. In other regions, it might be a bit different. Is that a correct mirroring back of what you've said, James?
Yeah, it's pretty much like democracy on technological steroids. I don't know how best to explain this, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's a little bit of that, Joanne. But you know, it's early days around this. We tried putting a DAO in place, and the legal advice we got in South Africa is that our legal framework could not accommodate it.
Yeah.
So in the end, we moved towards setting up a non-profit on the principles of a DAO as opposed to a DAO in its fullest form.
Interesting. We'll return back to that because I want to explore with all of you in a moment just some of the challenges and also opportunities.
But
So
John, before I don't be, if you're gonna go different, I do want to relate to the DAO issue and to the ideas of decentralization, even if DAO is a pretty advanced approach to that, if that's okay.
yeah, I was actually going to circle back to you and ask you to tell me more because you have a defined trust framework and it serves a very clear kind of guardrail, shall we say, to borrow a term Melanie has used before. And so maybe you could explain your thinking in the space of the DAO as it relates to your world.
Sure. And I want to build the fact that James brought up the DAO, I think is really, really interesting. You know, DAO is a very extreme approach to decentralization and democratization that are not necessarily exactly the same, right? And they're on the path between a centrally governed trust framework and a DAO. There are lots of options along the way. Most of the trust frameworks that exist today are centrally governed. Even I gave Visa as an example because it's interesting that it's not government owned. It's actually a privately owned framework. There are some interesting solutions that are governed differently, but most trust frameworks in the world are government central owned frameworks. And when you're looking at a global mobility across countries, regions, industries, and so on, that's a challenge because we have hundreds of almost 200 different countries and other territories. Everyone wants to govern their own thing in their own way. And then who is going to govern? Maybe the UN, but who is going to govern GDN? But who is going to govern the global elements? How do you create trust across all those jurisdictions? That's where there's a question. And at least we strongly believe, and that's the way we've set up the Velocity Network Foundation, that it needs to be decentralized versus Visa, where there is a company, a privately owned company that is in control of this trust framework. It works for everyone, but it still has its own interests. We believe that for a framework to really work at a global level, it shouldn't be owned by anyone. It should be decentralized. So the principles that James spoke about in terms of democratization, so everyone has a vote and a voice in defining the rules and the regulations and the governance and the frameworks and so on. And it's decentralized so that no one has their finger on the trigger. No one can control the network. No one can say, I don't want to play. No one can change the rules, right? Those are really important principles in the way the Velocity Network Foundation set up its governance and trust framework that is democratic and decentralized. There's a lot of conversation around. James mentioned blockchain. Blockchain is not the only way to set up a DAO. There are other distributed technologies, But there's a lot of discussion in our world, in the credentialing world, around whether we need blockchain or don't need blockchain. Personally, we're not embedded with blockchain, but the idea of decentralization is very important, and I'm happy to speak about that more. But but I don't want to waste everybody's time on that.
I can see Melanie wants to chime in. So over to you, Melanie.
I do. I have so many thoughts. You guys, we're never going to get to another question because, but one of the things I really want to play through this is both what James and Etan have said. First, I want to talk about the governance piece and tie it into something that James said around the different levels of interoperability. And often I think about interoperability at that multiple level thinking. And the thinking that I think is required in this kind of a network is an interoperability that I've been calling philosophical interoperability. That, there's semantic interoperability in terms of understanding what the definitions of the things are. What are you calling it? When you say this one thing, what does it mean to you, so that I can understand and contextualize it properly? But then there's a philosophical interoperability where there has to be some alignment of mutual goals. They don't all have to align, but there has to be enough alignment so that we can appropriately map across contexts. Because if there's not some alignment in philosophic interoperability, what are the end goals? Then we're not going to be able to match, and the networks aren't going to be able to mesh. And there will be gaps in the trust. And so that's all really, like, those two pieces I think are really key. And so interoperability, I think, does have three levels. I think we have the technical interoperability, which is often the easier one because you're talking nuts and bolts. But then the semantic gets challenging because everyone strongly is embedded in their definitions, and this is what we're calling it, and this is why. But the philosophical is what can knit all of that together. What are the principles underlying what's the end goal, and how do we accomplish that across multiple contexts?
Can I throw a question out? Because you're making me really pause and reflect. And I also want to mention to my audience, if you have questions that you'd like us to be probing, please put them in the Q&A, and I would be happy to represent your question for you with our panelists here, and weave it into the conversation. But I have a question. Why should, and let's use a technology vendor as an example. The technology vendor has created something. It's their intellectual property. It's not open source. They may have created it with open standards, one would hope, to ensure potential for future interoperability. But why should an industry vendor, let's say, bother with being ready for and supporting interoperability and working within the bounds of a trust framework like what each of you have described? And maybe I'll throw it to who would like to go first to answer this one. Otherwise, I'm just going to pick someone.
I thought we were going to stick with the first question, Joanne.
Well, I always like to bounce around, James.
Let me have a quick response, Joanne. And I come from the qualifications framework world. I've been working in that space for 30 years. And it's interesting that a private institution registers their qualification on the national framework. So some of their IP, some of the competitiveness and so on there's always a component of it that is open access. And when we started with NQFs, this was a big debate. And I'm just reminded of it as you speak. So when we now talk about, data interoperability and credentials, there's always something that has to be open source and has to be common, but it doesn't mean everything has to be open source and common, So there should be a way to still protect some IP, even in this new world that we're operating. That's just a thought that came to mind. I don't know if it helps you in answering your question.
Well, I think what you're talking about is balance. There is choices to be made and some balance, but what you've not said to me is opting out 100% is the way to go, which is interesting. Etan, what's your thoughts around this?
So I think there's a long history of interesting use cases around interoperability in other industries that has generally proven that interoperability has benefited the vendors and not hurt them. I'll just give two interesting examples. It's really interesting to read about the early days of the internet. I think we're all on this call old enough to remember when we used to dial into a CompuServe or America Online, and we could only exchange emails. It wasn't emails, but exchange messages with people within our network, right? There were closed intranets before the World Wide Web in the mid-90s. And you could only, so you were stuck within your network. And there's actually, if you read interesting of the management decisions in America Online, were arguing whether they should open America Online to the internet or not in the mid-90s. Because what our network, our closed network is our IP and our advantage. Of course, today we can't imagine anyone not being on the internet. And look what the internet did in the late 90s, early 2000s. What a boom, because everything became interoperable, because we can all see everyone's web pages. We could all interact by email with everybody. But there were real discussions by closed organizations saying, our closed network is our competitive advantage. Why would we want to open it up to the World Wide Web? So as a very extreme example, but even look at Apple now. I think it's with Apple 16, they've given get rid of their own plug and gone to USB-C. How much of an advantage is it that everyone in the family can use the same charger, right? And not have a unique charger for your iPhone because Apple wanted to do things differently. Interoperability in general, in many, many use cases, actually benefits everyone, and all boats rise when things move a lot easier and faster. The whole industry grows. That's not 100% true, and I don't think it's a black and white, like you said, Joanne. It's about finding the right place in the middle, but in general, there are many, many examples why opening and having common standards and open elements and interoperability is in the end benefits the whole industry and all the players in it.
I'd
So
love to.
Melanie, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I would love to jump in on that and just say that I agree with everything you've said. And I think that each industry, it's really it is really on the leadership of each industry to press for that kind of interoperability. Because in, like, say, the Apple case, that's probably much more consumer press. But in an industry like education, there is some consumer and public pressure, but I think it requires some leadership elsewhere. Like in the US, it's really taking leadership of associations, national level. We're not going to get government leadership in this space because we're so highly decentralized, and education is not it is not a federal priority. It's a state priority. And so it requires other national players to push for that kind of interoperability. And I love the use cases of thinking about it in other industries as ways to encourage our corporate spaces to become more interoperable.
So ACRO's doing some interesting work in developing some interoperability principles, which is a form of a trust framework. We have some governance principles that we're working on for the GDN that we're consulting on. That's a form of governance principles and trust framework. Can you talk a little bit about ACRO's work in this space, Melanie?
Sure. One of our projects is really engaged in how we enable the learner and employment record ecosystem to occur in the US. And the players are really highly decentralized. It's like herding cats in that environment. And so we've become more and more convinced over the last several years as we've been focused on this effort that it is going to require really broad industry collaboration. So over the last year and a half, we put together a collaboration of a dozen national higher education associations. And in order to develop a set of principles for the LER space within education. Our goal was twofold in this project. One is to define the principles, and then second, to create tool sets for institution-based professionals who might encounter the concept of an LER from any one of our 12 organizations, because we all play some role in that. And we realize that if we are not all speaking with one voice and pushing the industry in the same direction, that we're never going to realize it. We're really excited that we were able to design a set of principles that all 12 organizations have signed on to and have and support. And over the next year, we'll be pushing those out. We have an event coming up in early this summer to really talk with our technical partners about these principles and how everyone in the higher ed space, all of the association leadership, who all manage practitioners, who all work and lead and develop practitioners in the space, that we will all be saying the same thing. And so how will you help us to enable this? Because now you're going to get clear and consistent industry direction, which they've been asking for, frankly. You know, they're trying to build for their customers, and the industry has not always spoken in a single voice. And so that's our goal, is to help the industry speak in that single voice. What we have found is those principles have aligned very cleanly, honestly, with what is beginning to evolve out of the GDN, and also what has come, say, through UNESCO and the Global Convention. That is one of the ways that ACRO sees its role, is that without a central governing government force, we try to take the world and reflect it back to the US in order to influence direction and help our members understand what's happening in the rest of the world. Because while we're focused perhaps on the US, it's a global ecosystem, and it has to be globally interoperable.
Be an example of one of those principles that perhaps would be a little more contentious?
So I would say one of them perhaps is so I'll lay out a couple that maybe are a little bit more contentious. One is just systemically interoperable, which shouldn't be problematic. Designed for all users, so inclusive, accessible for all users, regardless of background, ability, or experience. That this is not an elite higher education effort. This is an effort that should touch all citizens. Skills-centered and competency-focused, which is a surprising one to come from higher ed, because higher ed has not spoken in the language of skills and competencies in the past. But we are hearing from our public, from our learners, from the employers, that we need to be more skills-centric and more competency-focused. And our learners need to understand better the skills and competencies that they're gaining from their education. And so as we engage in this, we need to be focused on the skills and competencies, not just the courses and credits and overarching credentials. And so those are two that are but we've got quite a few that I think really are. Oh, actually one more, centered on learner agency. That is a paradigm shift, I would say, for higher education. Higher education, we often think of the record as being the institutions. And while philosophically, there's no one in higher ed that would say that the learner, that the record in some form or fashion doesn't belong to the learner, because they have the learning. But the institution is the steward of that and exercises ownership of it in a very sort of proprietary way. And we are going to be looking at ways to make that less so. And what that's going to look like is going to evolve. And higher education has to grapple with what that means. It touches on lots of things, data structures and systems, but also business models.
Yeah, I can see that using skills and competencies as one example. I can see that your point about you're creating these as it relates to the learner and employment record. It's a particular type of credential. Is that correct?
So yes and no. I mean, we're speaking, because we're higher education, we're speaking about the credentials that we offer in higher education. But what we have attempted to do is generalize it and raise it up one level. Because we know that learners are gaining knowledge in lots of different ways now. Some are formal, some are informal. Some are institutional and academic pathway. Some are highly vocational. Some are institutional and not academic. Some are, massive online courses offered by third-party organizations. We are attempting to raise the level of discourse to a point that will begin to allow some interoperability across all of those forms of learning, because we want to be able to recognize all learning. All learning isn't equal, but all learning has some right to be recognized. And we need to create a philosophical, in addition to the technical, but we need to create a philosophical mindset that says that if we have enough information about the learning, that we will consider recognizing it, that we will make an adequate attempt to see if it fits within the new academic pathway that the learner has chosen, and find a way to recognize that. That's disruptive in a really big way. But it is what our learners expect now. And I think in some ways it's always what they've wanted. But now the learning is so accessible everywhere, and the means to document and validate that learning is becoming more and more accessible. And so we have to start looking at it and thinking about it and being creative and equitable in the way that we approach the recognition of that learning.
So it's interesting how you're using the trust framework as a tool to build a coalition of thinking and the willing, and provide the sort of the guardrails. I'm quite fascinated by that. James, I just wanted to do a check-in with you. Did you have some follow-up thoughts in regards to your context?
I only wanted to interrupt Melanie 5 times, but I kept back, Joanne.
That's okay, I can tell.
I think, I so agree with the things that she said. There's something happening globally where the supply and demand side discourses are becoming closer, or if we want to call it more interoperable. So the language, the nomenclature is becoming similar. So whether you talk to an employer that's writing a job description, or academic at a higher education institution that's writing a curriculum, the language is becoming similar. And that language for me is about learning outcomes. And so learning outcomes through our philosophy of lifelong learning, Melanie, I think you and I also aligned on that, is maturing, that we are starting to use the same vocab. And if we can convince the coders and the technical people just to code the stuff for us properly, I think we can have beautiful interoperable systems. But I often find that the techies, they just don't get this. I try and explain this to them so many times. It's like, if you can really get the coding right, that the systems on supply and demand side can coexist. We introduced the term credential fluency, that there's a fluency between supply and demand side discussions, but also around the things that I've explained. Then non-formal, formal, and informal learning can coexist on one platform. And then the question is back to where we started today, Joanne, about trust. Which of these learnings can I trust more than others? Because some have a gold standard. They are quality assured even by an independent agency. So they're like super credible and super trustworthy. Some are peer reviewed. So maybe like LinkedIn, I had a job at X place and 10 people can attest to it. So there's a peer review. and then others are self-attested. So in the work that I'm doing at the moment, we classify these 3 levels of, for want of a better word, trust: gold standard, peer-reviewed, self-attested. But the beauty is they can all coexist on a platform. And when they coexist, how do we distinguish between them? Do we want to distinguish? Maybe we do. It's a little bit like the WhatsApp blue tick. Do some have a double tick and some have one tick? And therefore, when I put them together, some are more trustworthy. I think these are the questions that we're grappling with at the moment.
So this brings in a whole other angle, which also talks about the academic side and the work that's going on with open recognition. But before we go there, I just want to sort of probe a bit, Etan, because we're looking at the typology of trust frameworks, and you have a very distinct one with the Velocity Network Foundation. Can you educate us and tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, and I do want to relate in answering your question to a few things Melanie and James just said, because they said very important things. I think Melanie said something earlier, which to me is incredibly important, and that is the need to create a common language and much more collaboration. We're involved, and as we're trying to drive the Velocity Trust Framework, and I'm talking to probably about 200 or 250 different projects around the world that are underway, and there are probably hundreds that I'm not aware of. And each one of them is, in different locations and different geographies and different industries, trying to create great things. And each one of them in itself is marvelous. But in the end, the sum of the pieces is not coming together as one beautiful working system. And that I think we need much more activity like the work Melanie was describing, not only within higher education, but across sectors and industries and so on, to create more common language and to work more together. I think is a critical element to drive adoption, because all these separate islands are not coming together into really something that really works at a global scale. And I think that one of the challenges that we found working on the Velocity Network Trust Framework relates to another thing that Melanie was talking about, and that is it's not impossible. It's not easy. The work that's being done is not easy, but it's not impossible to agree on philosophical areas for most of us. But what we've learned is the real challenge happens one layer down, not at the tech level, not the programming level. When you break down some of these elements to what they practically mean, we find that there's often a lot more disagreement than is necessarily seen when we say the principle we agree on. I mean, I won't get into learner agency, although we can talk about what learner agency means. I actually want to take one that theoretically should be easy, because privacy, there are laws in every country, right? And the laws are clear. Their laws are changing all the time. But what is when there's a principle that we need to maintain privacy, what does that mean? And a good trust framework needs to take the next level down and truly address and get to agreement about things, what it means. And let me give you 2 examples around private. Everyone agrees we should be private and retaining laws, but there's a big conversation within our community of whether dial home, the idea that if I've shared my credential as an individual with a third party, that in order to verify it, I need to dial back or contact in some digital way or not digital way the issuer, if that is privacy preserving or not, right? Some people think it is, and others say, wait, why should the issuer even know that the person is shared? If the person has agency, if they've earned it, why would I want to dial home, right? There's no agreement. The Velocity Network community has agreed that we don't support dial home for privacy related reasons and for survivability, but that's not an agreement within the global ecosystem. Many issuing institutions want to be dialed home to and want to know what's going on. And that's a question. Does that meet the requirement of privacy or does it not? These are real life examples that a trust framework needs to make decisions about. It can't leave them open, because it actually affects the way data flows and what are the requirements and what are people signing when they're agreeing. Or another really important example we've bumped into in our work is the idea of data minimalization. There's an important concept in the world of privacy around the idea of data minimalization, the idea that an individual should be able to provide as little data for the purpose of a specific transaction as possible. I don't need to share my birth date and my address to show that I'm over 21 to be able to buy a beer. I should be able to just be able to prove that I'm over 21 without showing someone a document that has other information and exposes other information about me, right? That's data minimalization. That's the idea of data minimalization. But that also conflicts with real life challenges that exist in the labor market. For instance, in the US, you're not allowed to share a nursing license in Missouri if you also have a nursing license in Minnesota without sharing the other one. Why? Because public protection, the public should know that if one of your licenses has been revoked, that you're dangerous to the public, even if the other one has not. That's a really important public protection issue, but it conflicts with data minimalization. A working trust framework, a real working trust framework, has to figure out how to deal with that conflict in real world, because it needs to make a decision. There needs to be a right way of dealing with public protection for nurses and data minimalization to a degree that respects people's privacy. How do you do that? And these are just two small examples that are not at the tech level, but they're not just the principle, but they're real life problems that a good trust framework has to deal with, work at, figure out a solution, get to agreement, so that it can actually operate with real world problems that exist.
So you bring some of the challenges forward in some of your remarks as we're looking at the opportunities and challenges and strengths and weaknesses of various trust frameworks. I think what you're saying, it's important to have one, it's important to adopt one, but your work doesn't stop there. Is that fair to say? You need to go deeper. You need to understand the purpose and context for the exchange and be very careful in determining that what is that final purpose for the data being exchanged, and what are the levels of trust assurances that are needed, that and what we call in the global convention work, etc., what you call as data minimalization is also framed sometimes as selective disclosure. So in essence, it's that balance between the rights of the broader group versus the right of the individual, and how to mesh those two. Are there others that want to make comments around this space? Are there perhaps even other challenges we haven't teased to the surface? Melanie.
I would say I agree that the privacy example is really an interesting one. In particular, I'm thinking about the callback and higher ed's position on that is, higher ed would want to be able to validate, because we also want the ability to revoke if needed, correct? And so to have it out there, we need to know. We'd also like to know, and that's, I think an individual's privacy probably trumps that desire to know. But the validation piece is really important. There are technical ways to manage that, and I think that eventually we will get to that place. When I think about it, there's another layer as you start to look at it globally. I think about the case of refugees. The protection of an individual aligned with their need to validate their credentials, whether, whatever kind of credentials they are, and their protection perhaps in a space where there's a hostile space back where they earned that credential. And we need to build those kinds of conversations or those kinds of protections in a way that still progresses the trust. And that's a real challenge. And I think that will continue to be a conversation and a challenge until we come to a place where that validation doesn't require any other interventions. I don't know how far we are from that. I think right now we're pretty far from it. And I think these kinds of global challenges are going to continue to erupt all over the world because we're human beings.
Yeah, this is the area of self-attestation as well. There was a really interesting, I was just reading this morning about one of the Canadian schools. They've developed a tool that allows them to assess prior learning as self-attested by the learner, and actually determine equivalencies. It's quite fascinating. Embedded in that is trust in that learner self-attestation, which takes us into a really interesting space from an open recognition point of view. Swinging it back to trust frameworks conceptually, I want to make it real though. So we have in our audiences credential evaluators and so on. Let's pretend it's a credential evaluation firm that's about to embark on a technology renewal. Or we could pretend it's a nursing or a healthcare credential evaluation organization, and they're about to uh, explore new tech to better move credentials around, both to receive them and send their credential, their certificate along. If we think about a trust framework, is this something that they should worry about? And even if we don't call it a trust framework, if we call it principles, should they be thinking about shared principles for their organization that would be important to them? And would trust frameworks potentially offer a solution there? And James, you recently were proceeding down this path for some work you were doing with JET. Did you talk about this? And was this why the DAO as a concept started to emerge?
Maybe to some extent, Joanne, your request came to me like, when you prompt a large language model, you assign it a role. So thanks for treating us like large language models. I just on a side, but to respond to your question more seriously, I think there's something about the conversation we're having at the moment around the trust framework that links all the way back to Etan's example of the Forex. And I want to just emphasize this point, whether it's nursing, to the case study that they're talking about, or more broadly, the Forex conversion system across the globe is very well established. It allows us to be interoperable without changing countries' currencies in a way. Eh?
Are you talking about foreign exchange?
Yes, Forex like foreign exchange, like money.
Thank you.
So it feels like the Forex exchange for credentials is something, it's a key that we must look at closer. And I think a lot of it's got to do with taxonomies and crosswalks between taxonomies, not replacing, but linking. And I think if I'm a nursing body that is concerned about the things we're talking about today, I would work actively with my professionals in my community and with my government and with my companies around me to try and find this converter so that my nurses in my province or my county or my country can be matched with nurses in another country or county. And that if that Forex converter starts working, just for want of a better word, then perhaps it can work for another sector, and perhaps it can actually, aggregate up to countries having Forex converters that can be trusted. Maybe I'm getting too carried away, but that's the thought that I had, Joanne.
Well, it's kind of an interesting metaphor that you're playing out, which is quite apt. It's interesting to me. Etan or Melanie, did you want to chime in?
I would say I think it is an interesting concept. I think that if I were to reflect back in the US context, I think regulated professions are probably the ones that are the most likely to be able to begin to do that. But we also have challenges just within the US, state to state, right? Because the regulatory framework is across states, it's not national in most of the regulated professions, not all, but most. But I think it is very interesting to think about it in those ways. I think we have some of the pieces in place to do it. We have strong descriptors. We have NQFs in most countries, not in ours yet, but we are working on it. So those could be mapped. And then within professions, you could map skills, competencies, outcomes, that would be, what is the baseline minimum in order to have that exchange. But it's less concrete than currency. And so
Sure.
it will be, it's a sophisticated process that I'm not sure. I don't know if we're going to get there in my lifetime. But I'm hopeful. I am hopeful, because I think the pieces do exist.
Etan, do you have
But
any comments on
I
that?
want to build on something Melanie just said and add to something you asked about how would someone approach this. So I agree with Melanie 100% that this is more complex, significantly more complex than the Forex example. But I do think, and this is where what are the decisions we made very early in the game. I think it's important to break the problem into at least two. To keep us short, I'll break it into two different conversations. There's a conversation about, we'll call it the mail system, how data flows in a way that it goes from the right place to the right place in a way that it cannot be, it's immutable, that can be trusted, and that it comes from the source, it goes to the person, it can't be changed along the way, to an element, and that what from a verifiable credentials, that's what's in the wrapper, that's what defines the rules, that's the way the internet works, the trust over IP elements and so on. And the element of the content of what's being transferred, how that's evaluated, how that's understood, the semantic elements that Melanie and James talked about earlier, the equivalency of that, the recognition of that, which is a very different problem. Both problems have to be solved for this to truly work, but they're different problems. And actually, in our belief, and this is where we focused as a Velocity network, the element of the movement of the data between issuers, individuals, and relying parties in a trusted way around the world can work today like Forex. The element of the understanding, the evaluation, the equivalency is much, much more complicated. And it becomes more complicated because it's also changing faster than we can put frameworks in place, right? Because of technology and so on. So at least, I think those are they're both important conversations. At least we've decided to focus our effort on the one that we believe can be addressed today, because there are very similar types of problems from a distribution, data movement, and trust like Forex that is working already in 2025 globally and can be adopted in that way. And just the last thing, I know we're out of time, but I do want to say that if an organization, because to answer your question, Joanne, as an organization is trying to evaluate how to approach this, I think it needs to look at different frameworks, trust frameworks, and say, what's the level of assurance there? Is it local or global? And is it important to us to be local or global? Is it private or public? And is it important for us to be on a private solution or on a public solution? Is it centralized, or how are decisions made? Is it centralized or decentralized? And questions like, what's the legal framework? What happens if something goes wrong? Who's accountable? Is there legal protection for when things happen? There's, some basic questions that, just to start out with, there are differences between different existing trust frameworks, and organizations should be evaluating different alternatives based on some of those questions that I ran through quickly, but we can have a much longer conversation.
Yes, and in fact, we are at our time. We will be having one more session in the series next month that's going to explore the healthcare sector, and then we'll do a wrap up. We are also essentially saying to everybody, if you're going to go down this path, it's worth taking a look at some of the trust frameworks that are out there to help save you some time. And I take your point, Etan, that's certainly what we did. We didn't try to solve all the equivalencies first out of the gate when we created the national network in Canada. We focused first on creating the highway. And once we had created the technology highway, the rest actually is starting to follow, including opportunities for open recognition, et cetera, that all of you have raised here. So I want to thank our guests for coming today. I want to thank our audience. We will be publishing this session along with others on the website URL, which I shared through the chat, and other links that might emerge to help explain this further. Can't thank you enough, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. I appreciate you taking the time out of incredibly busy schedules to share your expert knowledge and pivot and so on all the questions that I've asked. Thank you so much and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.